Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Larp. I'm Abby, and I'm joined today by two friends, Maddie from Skilltree and Kent, who's from our home game. And today we're going to be talking about player agency in the game of Reckoning. So Reckoning as a game places a high value on player agency. It's a new game that started in the Midwest this year, and so we all attended and got to encounter the different ways that player agency can impact your gameplay as a character. This world is populated by a lot of different factions with a lot of different relationships to the other factions, and this led to a lot of tension that was mounting by the second day of the event between different factions who had been at war with one another for already a decade up until this point in the game.
So this tension really did lead to a big battle in the end, but our characters didn't really go with the flow, did we? So all of our characters, we all tended to be sort of like more peace-focused and trying to keep the peace, and we objected morally to why the battle was happening. And I remember there was a point where, when the battle was starting, we looked at each other and we were curious about how much we could do out of character without interfering with the game, and how much our player agency could play into it. And we decided to march between the two lines with the neutral flag up, and we were terrified.
It was not a good idea, probably.
It was not a good idea, of course not. But we marched to the other side, and we talked to their side and said that we had gathered all of the artisans, all the healers and everything, which we were also part of. And we were going to be neutral. We were going to heal anyone when we didn't stand with what our faction was doing. Yeah. Which isn't something that a lot of times you would really find in a game where, like, you can just totally, like, two massive factions and then just walk between them and have this epic moment.
When that battle happened and the events leading up to it, we really didn't know how things were going to turn out. And when we had the three factions and you going up there and trying to negotiate peace, it was like sitting in the background waiting for the gunshot to sound around the world. That one event that causes everything to collapse on itself. As the fight actually began, it just... all three factions turning on the Hadrians and completely wiping them out. It was very interesting, and it wasn't what we thought was going to happen. Like, we were so sure that somebody was going to side with the Hadrians and it was going to be kind of a 2 versus 2, but it never happened.
And I don't think the runners of the game knew what was going to happen either. I think that the battle was kind of facilitated, but there had been so much going on, like you mentioned, between the different factions. Like, the Vatican were getting potentially paid, but they didn't like how much they were being paid, and it was all player decision. When everyone turned against the Hadrians, that was just people deciding to do that. And when we went between the lines, that was entirely a decision of ours. And when you eventually joined us to protect us to heal Hadrians when everyone was being slaughtered, that was a decision that nearly got you killed. But, like, everything from, like, who was fighting who, these massive, what would be plot points, was all decided by the players.
Yeah.
And so during the course of this battle, there were actually some relationships that were forged. I already know Kent out of game, and our characters kind of got knit together by us having similar goals. And I had already become friends, my character Kit had already become friends with Evelyn.
Partners in
crime. Before this point, but this sealed the deal. Running over to enemy lines and interacting with the Hadrian Centurion. And if you know anything about the game, you know Rivlins, our faction, and Hadrians are kind of like cats and dogs. And so to run up and say, hey, we're against this battle and we don't agree with this slaughter, which turned into a real slaughter. At that point, one of the leaders of the Hadrian faction basically said, you are people of honor and you will have eternal hospitality from our faction. You will always be safe with us and you have our eternal friendship.
But you wanted that in writing after.
I wanted that in writing because I don't trust words from a man wearing a red coat. So after the battle, I talked to Evelyn, or Kit talked to Evelyn about this and was like, I want that written down. I would like that in paper so that I can frame that and not have to run into any problems down the line.
So we fetched a scribe.
Not a scribe. So actually, the Hadrian Centurion, he had a scribe, and so he wrote up an official writ,
contract,
a contract of our eternal friendship, and that was another character decision. That when we made a decision to do something, he deemed this is a really nice thing that they're doing, and so we got eternal friendship out of it.
Yeah, and the Centurion, he was an NPC in the game, and he helped facilitate that we had made this choice, which was completely out of what everyone else was doing. And, like, it led to us having this lasting relationship with the Hadrians, written in paper, which can play a big role in future games.
In doing that, we formed a positive relationship with one kind of NPC, one leader type character. There was another one that, at the time, my character was forming kind of, like, attitudes towards. So we had a quest giver who was this, like, morally gray kind of character that my character admired, but also had this competitive kind of vibe towards, I want that job. I want to be the person who has the money to be able to force people to do things and, like, tell people to go do things for her.
You just want money.
You just want money and power.
And so I went to the only person that I thought would be foolish enough to mess with the quest giver. I went to Kent, and I was like, Kent, you know, there's so much happening right now, and there's so much discord between the factions. Who's a neutral party that could potentially be trying to stir this up to benefit herself? Like, could you imagine anybody who that could be?
So, I spent most of my day, upon this conversation that had happened a bit earlier, upon other things, and other people basically coming up and telling me, we think this character is behind a lot of the things that have been happening, and me thinking to myself, well, I'm stupid enough to go do this, so might as well. And that's kind of what ended up leading me up to nearly being killed by most of the Rivlins, and having somebody put a bounty out for me. So this particular quest giver, I was doing my best to kind of get her to start to trust me, so I could just gain any inkling of what they were doing behind the scenes, and try to figure out, like, if I could use any of that to, like, as evidence to the Hadrians or the Rivlins to, like, stop this fight, because from what we understood that there could be a greater foe. And that leads into when, after the fight, I grabbed one of our bow knitters. Her name was Ash, and I grabbed her, and I'd been working with her to build relationships with the Hadrians because she had been talking to some of them. And I remember we went across from the, after the battle, I came with her, I'm like, I'm here with a bone knitter, because I have my sword on me, I'm a warrior, I'm like, I'm not here to kill you, here's the bone knitter, I'll pay for anybody.
We come in peace.
Yeah, we come in peace, I'm willing to pay anybody who's currently can't afford to be healed. And I remember actually paying for the scribe who had gone down.
And gave us a writ.
Who gave us the writ. And it gave me the opportunity, I had a short conversation with the Centurion, who basically was like, why did this happen? And I began to learn a little bit more about the other player agency that was going on and some of the other plots that were happening with the other factions. And I hand him a assassination quest that I had for him. That basically at this point I was lucky enough to have been given it by the Countess.
So so she was telling you to go and kill an important officer, basically.
Exactly, and it was very interesting that I got it, and by all luck, he introduced me to the Sage Camilla, and she ironically had the same kill assignment, but for the bailiff
Of our faction.
of our faction.
So basically, you all were able to notice that strings were being pulled to pit us against each other, get this quest, and then make the choice to... And I was like, no, I'm not gonna kill this guy. I'm gonna tell him someone wants him dead.
Yeah.
And then decide to turn against the quest giver instead, because it felt like they were working against the greater good.
Yeah.
And I think, it pulled me in on that one.
Yeah, so immediately after I came to Camilla and we decided to, well, how can we pull this one over on the quest giver, I went and talked to the bailiff, which is our bailiff, to show him that the Hadrians had the opposite. I showed him that I had the Hadrian kill order, and basically asking him, somewhat of also as just a player, kind of asking Evan, are we allowed to kind of do this to an NPC? Like, are we allowed to cast a spell on her? How will that work? And for the most part, he was okay with it, and that's how the main issue is that like Abby said, we don't trust anything that isn't in writing. So we needed somebody to take notes over the conversation that was happening between the quest giver. And we ended up running an Evelyn, who was more than willing to...
a pencil and paper.
who's more than willing to help us take those notes.
Yeah, so as the note taker, I have a lot of memories of the discussion, and we learned a lot of information about the different potential threats going on, and like the monsters of the game were potentially going to come attack. We learned through her that they were working with her, and they seemed to be intelligent enough to have these deep plans, and we eventually convinced her to set up a meeting so that we could talk things over with the monsters.
Yep.
And try to see if there was any sort of peaceful way to resolve whatever grudge they held against us.
It was such a terrible
Which
idea.
was, like, out of game. We even got told by NPCs, they're like, we did not expect anyone to want to talk to the monsters.
That was very out of...
But she was like, I will arrange this meeting. And it genuinely started to be put into motion.
Yeah.
It was just... Eventually, because of rain and
circumstances,
and some other circumstances, that we still went on this quest. It just happened off screen, which then led into
the final battle.
Which basically, the monsters didn't want to talk. It turns out everyone else was right, and they don't like talking, and they captured us instead.
So given that there was this potential threat that we recognized of monsters going to attack all the factions, and there being a need to be some kind of unification, there were a lot of little mini quests we were following towards the end of the day where Volter particularly was running from place to place trying to get the Hadrians to, commit their weapons to this fight that we believed was coming, and me chasing after Volter into the Hadrian camp because I knew they loved me. I knew that I was their eternal friend.
And our friend had obsessions with certain objects.
Yeah, and so you were pursuing these things that you were trying to get into the Hadrian camp, and so I followed you, assuming that probably you were going to say something really stupid to get you killed. And so I followed, and I was like, my silver tongue will get Volter out of this situation. I will be able to get him out of this.
Especially because it took us so long to figure out that they even had it in the first place.
Yeah, and so we get into the Hadrian camp, and we begin talking to the Centurion who remembers us. And we're able to have a positive interaction where we are able to negotiate, hey, will you commit your forces and these items you have to potentially, uniting with our faction and the other factions in order to fight this oncoming threat, and we negotiate out this kind of deal, and then we get to also enjoy, when there's a giant downpour, this hospitality of the Hadrians, where we end up in their tents waiting out this downpour as a couple kind of unimportant Rivlins who are basically, the cats to their dogs.
Yeah, and it's funny how we were the only group to ever walk in that camp and not get immediately at sword point. They knew exactly who we were and what we were doing. But there was a really fun interaction that I had with a couple of the Hadrians as I was sitting in the camp during the torrential downpour that happened. Mm-hmm. And this was mostly out of character as we just kind of talking about the event and stuff. And it was interesting to hear how they were telling me about how them as a faction, a lot of the things that they were trying to do, a lot of their own personal goals and some of the things that they and their friends were trying to do during Larp, the good that they're actually trying to do, because a lot of them wanted peace to a degree, and how none of that was working. At every point, things just kind of went wrong, and they told me at that point, they asked me what I did, and I'm like, oh yeah, I was the one that did this, and this, and they're like, if it wasn't for you having done any of that, none of the things that we did would have happened. And it was just interesting how your specific actions really helped us in doing what we wanted to do. And it was interesting how this kind of came to me, yeah, we really feel indebted to you in what you did, and how you just kind of, instead of choosing to fight the Hadrians, choosing to side with them, actually try to help them. And how that kind of influenced a lot of the events that happened towards the end of the game. So it was just a really fun interaction that was very memorable.
And so while we were kind of, in that Hadrian camp, sitting out the rain, I also was with the Centurion in his tent getting to talk about just life as our faction being occupied, our faction's land being occupied by this other faction, and getting to interact and have these positive kind of just chats about life and happiness and what it meant to be, people who are successful in the world. And we got to watch several more contingents of characters exercising their agency and coming to try and negotiate the exact same peace that we'd negotiated before the downpour. We saw a bunch of armed people who were kind of like they were kind of a mercenary group coming, and they came to negotiate that peace.
With swords.
With swords.
And then we saw like a veritable army, a peace corps armed with swords, come like an hour later to negotiate the same peace. And so all these players, while the Centurion probably didn't like having to go through the same negotiation for the same result 3 times in the rain, it was really fun to get to see these different characters exercise their ability to impact the game and really be trying to impact the outcome of the game with regards to what factions were aligned with who and who was going to come to whose aid.
It was just so interesting to see the different, everybody trying to do the same goal and each trying to do it differently.
I think that really highlights the concept of, like you said, everyone's going about their own way. Like, there was a mercenary group, they came to negotiate with kind of threat and force. There was a Peace Corps who came to negotiate kind of as an emotional appeal. And you guys, and eventually I showed up later to try and stop the Peace Corps from being attacked.
And then you saw us there. And you're like, oh, thank God.
I was like, oh, thank God. You guys negotiated more using logic and the previous, like, hey, we've helped each other in the past. We're good for, like, a good relationship, and this will help us all. And throughout all these different approaches, the choices that we all made led to the result, and other people's choices kind of came together to mesh in the end and gave us the ending that it wasn't like a plot ending that was planned. It was completely based off of like the fact that we stood against it. We became forever friends, which led to us being able to ask that of the Hadrians, which led to us being able to stop the Hadrians from attacking the Peace Corps.
And ended up causing so many people to be able to like band with one another, expanded so many people's like their own organizations that they were creating, and just it was also interesting to see just like personal plot threads and things that you were doing and how like, wait, I did that and that caused all that to happen. This is interesting to see like just the ripple effect between everybody's different player agency and how that kind of all culminated at the very end during that final battle.
In conclusion, a game with player agency seems to be something that can actually work. If someone had told me before Reckoning all the ways that these plot threads would be impacted by character choices and actually facilitated by staff members who were communicated to, and then they were willing to organize situations in which these kind of plot threads would be able to reach a satisfying resolution, I would be like, no way can staff members do that effectively, and no way is it possible for every single player to be able to impact the game if they choose to. But it really seemed like those that chose to impact the game would find ripple effects among other characters, things that were made possible because people had gathered together or spoken together, and these things were facilitated by an effective staff who had made the decision to make a game that incorporated a high level of player agency.
And I think in the end, like, those choices became so much, like, they were so meaningful. And the end that we got was so meaningful because we worked for it. It was our goal and we drove for it. And like you said, like, those players were genuinely grateful for opening up new avenues of play. Player agency was present throughout the game, both in those big plot points, but also in the little things of, like, when we eventually got possessed. Players were given agency of how that affected them going on, just how they role-played the effects once the possession was cleared.
Yeah.
And it really let everyone share a piece of this world and make the world their own.
It did seem to make things more meaningful, made it more personal to each other characters, and it felt like much more like a living, breathing world that you were really immersed in. Like, the one thing I liked the most was that my smallest actions seemed to have ramifications, especially dependent on who those actions were to help or to hinder. Even the smallest things that you might have thought weren't going to have any repercussions could have really big repercussions. And so it's fun to see how these plot points will just kind of be expanded upon and how people will take it during the next LARP, and I can't wait to see how I will screw it up in the end.
Or save the day.
No, that will not happen.
Alright guys, we hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you so much for joining us, Kent and Maddie.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for being my partner in crime.
Nothing better to do.
If you did enjoy the video, don't forget to like and subscribe and follow all of our socials.
If you have any interesting experiences with player agency in your LARP adventures, then leave them in the comments below. Love to know them.
We'll see you next time.
And adventure awaits.
Okay, I did the one video. Why did you tie me up again?
Toady, closet.
What? Closet? You can't. That wasn't the deal.
The deal has changed. The new deal is we keep you until we're monetized.
You can't just keep me here. Ben? Let me out, Ben!
Hey, is this a bad time? Where's your guys' restroom?